on the background before I invite one of our technical committee persons, Ms. Anthea Joshua, who will be going through the presentation on the aquaculture. But these two standards, we would have started some time ago as part of a food and agriculture FAO project, looking at strengthening agricultural commodities in St. Lucia. So we did a type of working draft development, as I indicated, using the process, where through the support of FAO, we were able to bring the key experts together to get their feedback and develop those working drafts. And subsequent to that, we were able to put it through the national process where it's no longer just a project deliverable, but it becomes part of our national standards and available not only to the project participants, but it's available to anybody in St. Lucia who would like to use those standards. And the aim of the project at the time was really about developing potential certification programs. And that's how we end up with two codes of practices, one for aquaculture and one for small ruminants. And the idea is that the farmers, the practitioners themselves can apply to be a certified practitioner in aquaculture or those with the small ruminants. And it doesn't mean that you have to have certification to apply those standards. And that's why we're making it national now, because it's going to be available whether or not you're interested in the certification or any certification program. These standards as well, as of this morning too, I was reminded that these standards are also going to be used as part of training tools and development of specific educational standards so that the students can refer and use those standards as part of their instructions. And when they actually go into practice, they still use the same standards. And the codes for small ruminants will really assist persons who handle and manage small ruminants. It outlines the sound husbandry practices and the basic requirements for the welfare of the animals. And the one for aquaculture is focused on really responsible farming aquaculture practices, encourage the producers to minimize any environmental as well as any social impacts of aquaculture farming. And we hope that through the use of these two standards and adoption of these two standards, we would have a sort of improvement in our country's competitiveness. And that would be used to enhance the ability of us here in St. Lucia to trade, as well as protecting our farmers against unfair trade practices. So that is it for me. Let me thank you for just this brief on the SLBS and background to the standards. And I will now invite Ms. Anthea Joshua to do for us the bit on aquaculture.
Okay, good morning, everybody. The contents of the standard as follows. You have the scope, you have the references, terms and definitions, you have general principles and guidelines, handling and transportation, stocking density, monitoring, recording and record keeping, employees development, animal welfare, and annexes A to F. Okay, so we'll start with the scope. This code of practice gives the general principles and guidelines for environmentally sound design and operation and management of aquaculture farms. Okay. The definitions will encompass the list of terms here from aquaculture itself up until the settling pond. Okay. Okay, general principles and guidelines. First thing you have to look at is site selection. Okay, This is key in developing your aquaponics, your aquaculture system, right? Because you need to ensure that you have your water source, that because of where it is sustainable. Because if you have to be bringing water in each time, and a lot of the activities you have to do requires more than normal, that's definitely not an ideal selection area for selection. It might be where you have, but maybe that's not the production system that you should be into. Okay. In areas that are, one thing we need to notice that in areas that existing flora and fauna shall be determined relative to ecologically sensitive areas such as migration routes, nesting grounds, etc. So we do not want to upset the natural environment in developing the system, because by doing so, you will be hampering both your production and whatever exists in the environment. Okay. So in addition to site selection, we have site management, we have farm design and construction, the use of water, the discharge of water and effluent management, use of drugs, chemicals, potentially toxic pesticides and fertilizers, storage, stock selection and stocking practices, introduction of exotics and GMO, LMOs, feed use and management, fish and plant health management, harvesting practices, predators. Yeah. So these are some of the general principles and guidelines that are covered by the standard. Okay. Handling and transportation. Handling of live fish plants should be kept to a minimum and should be done using the least stressful method. The movement and transport of live fish plants should be done as quickly as possible and with adequate oxygen supply. Strictest control procedures should be applied to the fish or plants that are transferred between the farm and freshwater catchment areas in order to reduce the potential transfer of disease to a minimum. Marine transportation is also considered in that section. So you have the general information on that, and then there are protection of waterways from marine chemicals, land transportation. So yeah. Yeah, so the transportation of the plants, fish can be done either via marine transport or on land transportation. However, with the concern for the environment, it is outlined to ensure there's minimum impact on the environment. Okay, stocking density. So we're looking at planning the stocking densities and stocking with different species. So in your design of your system, you have to take into consideration how much fish plants it could carry based on the size they get to. And also, well, the species available in St. Lucia presently is kind of monitored, so we don't have to worry too much about, although a wide range of species can be produced in the system, but because we get most of our stock from the Department of Fisheries, it makes control over what is being produced a little more much easier for monitoring. Okay, now monitoring, documentation, and record keeping. Records, that's one of the things that we always keep in our heads, and this is one of the things we require that it is written, right? So monitoring and record keeping, the fish farm shall have a monitoring and record keeping system for tracking operational activities. Separate records should be kept for different production types, conventional or organic. Accurate and up-to-date records should be kept for the breeding system, feeds and feeding, water exchanges, disease control and prevention, health and welfare management, farm hygiene, feeding, etc. Employee development, training. Personnel should be properly trained for each activity they undertake. Training should take place in anticipation of the needs rather than reacting to the situations. Staff should be provided the appropriate training and equipment to complete their responsibilities. Employee health and safety. Firms shall ensure that all national health and safety requirements are fulfilled. Provide first aid and emergency medical equipment at all work sites, on vessels and in vehicles. Keep first aid supplies and other emergency equipment in good working order at all times, at all locations. Okay. Employee welfare is a thing that normally overlooked on farms because our concern is more for the product, the produce that we produce, what are we producing? But it is very important that, especially in these days, that employee development is also looked at when developing your farming system. Animal welfare. For factors that can be controlled by the farmer, every effort should be made to ensure that the animal welfare is protected. Regularly inspect animals and their enclosures or culture locations. Care shall be taken to ensure that shellfish do not remain in direct sunlight or out of the water for extended periods prior to refrigeration. Care shall be taken to ensure that shellfish do not remain in direct sunlight. Okay, that's just a repetition. Okay. Annex A, recommended disinfectants and their use. Annex B is data management. Annex C is marine transport information. Annex D, recommended stocking rate based on species and culture systems. Annex E is carrying capacity. And Annex F is employee development. So these annexes are more for information, and it will just give you guidance as to how to tackle those areas.
Yes.
So we open to comments.
Just use the raise hand. Over to the section on aquaculture, on small ruminants, sorry, which will be handled by Ms. Saskia Augustine.
Okay, hi, morning everybody. So this is the Code of Good Agricultural Practices for Small Ruminants. Okay, so you can also access this standard on the link previously. Okay, so on the table of contents, we have the scope, normative references, terms and definitions, site selection, requirements for feeding, water, drought, shelter and facilities, management and husbandry, protection, reproduction and breeding, euthanasia or humane destruction, slaughter, transportation, documentation and record keeping, and then we have annexes A to D. They're all informative. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's begin with the scope. So this code of practice will assist persons who handle and manage small ruminants. It outlines sound husbandry practices and the basic requirements for the welfare of small ruminants. It is intended to encourage farmers to adopt good practice of husbandry, care, and handling. Okay, so these are some of the terms and definitions in there: adverse weather, animal at risk, attendance, claiming pen, container, drought, loading density, non-ambulatory animal, segregates, unfit animal, vehicle, small ruminants, veterinarian, veterinarian personnel, and stockmen. Okay, so again, like the aquaculture standard, the first clause is on site selection. So these are just some of the factors that should be considered when deciding on location of a farm. So we have topography, accessibility, the zoning requirements, site history, drainage, sun exposure and wind direction, as well as climatic factors. And bear in mind, there are also other factors in the standard. Okay, so we have the next clause is requirements for feeding. So that encompasses feed. So when we speak about feed, we're referring to a balanced diet fed to these ruminants. The ration should be free of spoilage or contaminants, and also other medications that are being prescribed to these ruminants. They should be approved by a licensed vet. There's also feeders and pastures or browsing areas. For pastures, in the standard, it looks at keeping the yard safe and free of materials that would cause injury to these animals, such as wires, nails, etc. Okay, our next clause is water. The next subclause is water requirements. So the basic water requirements are potable water shall be readily accessible. Watering points should be of sufficient capacity and allow safe access. So following that, we have water requirements for goats and sheep, and finally the watering devices. So in looking at watering devices, we're looking at those devices should be kept clean and working properly for these ruminants. Okay, our next clause is drought. So basic requirements that owners and managers with limited or no previous experience of drought management should seek advice from qualified advisors. Drought-affected animals are highly susceptible to stress and require careful handling. Drought-affected animals should be protected against exposure to extremes of temperature and weather. And of course, in the standard, other requirements are highlighted for drought. Okay, our next clause is shelter and facilities. So in looking at that, we have shelter, tethering, fencing. Well, tethering means to confine an animal to a specific location. So we're using ropes or chains. It's a lot like what we see when we have goats and sheep, you know, how persons tie them to a little branch of a tree for the entire day. So that's what we refer to as tethering. And in the standard now, it looks at that animals should be able to have easy access to food. They should be able to move about without injury, that sort of stuff. We also have fencing, buildings, pens and space allowances, flooring and bedding under that clause. Okay, so our next clause is management and husbandry. In there, our main subclauses are handling, marking, castration. Under castration, we have castration in goats. Next subclause is dehorning or disbudding, followed by health. And in health, the following subclauses are general, inspection, lameness, external and internal parasites, casualties, and dosing equipment. Okay, so our next clause is protection. So we're looking at protection from climatic extremes, natural disasters, and predation. So all reasonable precautions should be taken to minimize the effects of weather that produce either cold stress or heat stress. In our case, it's more heat stress. We have protection from diseases. So sick, injured, or diseased animals shall be given prompt and appropriate treatment or humanely slaughtered. Advice should be sought from qualified advisors. Yeah, our following clause is reproduction and breeding. So our first subclause is goat requirements. Under there we have requirements for bucks, breeding, kidding and kidding facilities, neonatal care, fostering, artificial rearing of kids, and identification. Yeah, well, that's a continuation from reproduction and breeding. So we're now looking at sheep requirements. Under there, we have pregnancy and lambing and artificial rearing. Okay, so next clause is euthanasia or humane destruction. So effective and humane methods of destruction which cause a quick and painless death shall be used. This includes either shooting with a firearm or a captive bolt pistol. We have also, it looks at recommended practice for sheep and goat destruction, but that's also included in our annexes as well. So we just have two of these pictures here. It shows the humane destruction for sheep and goat. So the first method is behind the horns, a sort of method, and the second is a shot to the front. So these are just two of the requirements pointed out. Sorry, the recommended practices pointed out in the standard. Okay, so under slaughter, our next clause, we have fitness for slaughter, holding area, tools, the slaughtering process, stunning, bleeding and blood collection, dressing, inspection, and cooling. Okay, so transportation, these are some of the main responsibilities pointed out for this clause. So persons handling and transporting ruminants should be properly instructed and knowledgeable about ruminant behavior and welfare and shall comply with regulations of the relevant authorities. Drivers shall be responsible for the care and welfare of ruminants during transportation. Everyone who is directly or indirectly involved in the transportation of ruminants shall comply with the relevant regulations concerning the humane transportation of animals. So under that clause, we have further subclauses. We have vehicles. So in that, we're looking at the vehicles should be in excellent condition for transporting ruminants. I know we don't have a lot of that here in St. Lucia. They should also comply with the relevant legislation. These vehicles should be kept clean and disinfected. The further subclauses, we have loading and unloading, segregation, space allowances, feed, water, and rest for ruminants in transit and animals at risk. And I think that clause is actually very important because I know everyone has seen them transporting goats and sheep on the road in the back of the vans and they're ready to fall off and they don't have enough space, that sort of thing. So the standard looks at that closely. Okay, so this is a continuation. So we have two problems highlighted there in the table. That's overcrowding. So the warning sign is that the animals will not settle. You can see them scrambling and they're very noisy for prolonged periods. And you can also see them lying down and unable to get up. And the second problem is overheating. So our species will pant when overheated. Animals are standing with neck extended with open mouth breathing, and that's a dangerous situation. So these are just some of the signs pointed out. Okay, our next clause is documentation and record keeping. So that was also highlighted in our aquaculture standard, and most standards usually include a clause with documentation and record keeping, seeing that it's very important. So the farm should have a farm management manual instructing the rearing system, feeding and watering, farm management, animal disease control and prevention, animal welfare management, and farm hygiene. So these should be, this should detail housing preparation, feed, drinking water, reproduction and breeding, pest and disease carrier control and eradication, animal health management, and these are only some of the requirements pointed out. Okay, so this is our first annex on reportable diseases. I won't read out everything, but you can have a look at that in our standard. Okay, so we can move on to the next annex. All right, so Annex B is the recommended practice for humane killing of sheep and goats. So that was what I previously spoke to with the two pictures that we had. So these are some of the recommended practices. We have firearms, captive bolt penetrating stunner using a pistol, clubbing, bleeding out, and that is followed by other recommended practices for goats. So Annex C, that's also informative. Bear in mind, all of the annexes are informative. So like Anthea mentioned, they're guides. So this Annex C refers to the method of skinning and dressing small ruminants in small operations. Okay, so that was it for this standard. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that standard?